Daniel Reyes opened his eyes and smelled coffee. Not instant powder mixed with salt water. Not brown sludge from a rusty mug. Real, freshly ground coffee. He was lying in bed, in his own bed. The sheets were clean and dry. The ceiling was white and smooth. No rust, no mold, no swaying. Dan raised his hand and looked at it. His fingers were straight and strong. No cracks from scurvy, no scars from ropes. On his wrist was a watch. The very same watch he'd lost when he climbed out of the sinking helicopter off Galveston a year and a half ago. Or in a year and a half. Or never. He sat up in bed and stared at the wall. Cars hummed outside the window. Ordinary cars on an ordinary road. I-45 was gridlocked. Houston went about its business. People were driving to work. People were drinking coffee. People didn't know that in 3 months, all of this would be underwater. Dan remembered everything, every day, every hour. He remembered how the tanker Magellan picked him up on the 4th day after the rise. He remembered how he repaired pumps and generators in exchange for half a glass of murky water a day. He remembered how, on the 471st day, the first mate, a man named Mason Crow, announced that there were too many people on board. He remembered how the sailors graved those they deemed surplus and threw them overboard. He remembered the girl, about 14 years old, slender arms. She didn't scream, she just stared at him with her huge eyes. Dan stepped forward and shielded her with his body. 3 bullets pierced his chest. One after another, he fell overboard, face first. The last thing he saw in the black water was a blue glow from below. Something enormous was rising toward him from the depths. Then darkness. Then the smell of coffee. Dan got out of bed and walked to the window. May 14th, 2027. That's what it said on his phone screen. 94 days until the end of the world. He knew the exact date. August 16th. On that day, a fault in the Mariana Trench will release so much water into the ocean that sea levels will rise by 340 meters in 72 hours. New York, Tokyo, Shanghai, Mumbai, Amsterdam, everything will be submerged. 4% would survive, those who happen to be on ships or in the mountains. And then the real hell would begin. Piracy, famine, wars over fresh water, cannibalism on drifting cargo ships, and the risers, creatures from the depths for whom the surface would become hunting grounds. Dan finished his coffee. His hands weren't shaking. His head was clear. In his past life, he'd spent the first few days panicking. He'd tried calling the Ministry of Emergency Situations. He'd tried writing to the governor. He'd tried to warn someone. No one listened. This time, he wouldn't waste time worrying about being thought of as crazy. This time, he would build. He sat down at his laptop and opened a bank account. $340,000, everything he had, plus a loan secured against his apartment. That was exactly how much the decommissioned oil platform Atlas 7 was worth. He knew that platform like the back of his hand. 6 years of working on it. Every valve, every weld, every pipe. Chevron decommissioned it in 19 as a total loss after a series of power system failures. But Dan knew the truth. The platform was fine. The problem was 12 fuses, the wrong model. That blew at the same time. He'd written the report on it himself. They ignored him. The platform was abandoned. 180 miles from shore. The depth beneath it was 90 meters, shallow enough for the supports to hold after the water rose, far enough from shore that crowds of refugees couldn't reach it in inflatable boats. Dan knew that in the New World, a platform wasn't just a piece of rusty iron. A platform was a castle. Whoever owns a platform with a working desalination unit becomes king. He pressed the button to confirm the transfer. $340,000 were debited from his account. And at that moment, something that shouldn't have been there lit up in his peripheral vision. A translucent blue interface, like a projection onto his retina. Lines of text hung in the air right in front of him. The Seabase system is activated. Owner confirmed initial resource. One object, status 34%. Dan froze. This wasn't part of his previous life. Neither the system nor the interface. Nothing. He blinked. The interface didn't disappear. He tried to touch it with his hand. His fingers passed right through it, but the lines were sharp and clear. He could see the platform's structural diagram. Each module was color-coded. Red meant critical condition, yellow meant in need of repair. There was no green at all. The entire platform was ablaze with red and yellow. Dan closed his laptop. He stood up. He walked over to the window and looked out at Houston. In 3 months, the city would be under 100 meters of water. Almost all of these people stuck in traffic on I-45 would die. And there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't save the city. He couldn't save 1 million people, but he could save 30, maybe 50, if he started right now. First things first, he needed someone who knew how to weld steel. Dan took out his phone and dialed a number. A hoarse male voice answered. Dan said he needed a welder for a remote job. 3 months of work. Cash payment up front. The man on the other end of the line paused and asked what kind of job it was. Dan replied that it was an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The voice snorted and said that sounded like the beginning of a bad joke. But money is money. His name was Hank Morrison, 52 years old. 30 years of welding on shipyards and platforms. Hands like pliers and a temper like sandpaper. Dan knew him from his first life. Hank died 8 months after the rise. He drowned while trying to swim to another ship for spare parts. This time, he wouldn't drown. Dan hung up the phone and started making a list. Not in his head, on paper. 2 columns. The left column was what he needed to buy. The right column was who he needed to find. The left column had 230 items. Seeds, medicines, fuel, generator parts, solar panels, desalination membranes, tools, weapons. The right column contained 11 names. People he remembered from his first life. People who might be useful. People who deserved a second chance. The first name in the right column was Morgan Riley, a marine biologist, the only scientist he'd met in his past life who could explain what was happening to the ocean. The second name was Yuna Kim, a chef from Busan, a woman who died on the Magellan because someone thought she'd stolen a ration of water. Dan gripped the pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In his past life, he hadn't been able to protect her. In this life, she wouldn't die of pneumonia on a filthy tanker. He glanced at his watch. 8 in the morning, 94 days. Every hour counts? Dan grabbed his car keys and left the apartment. The elevator moved slowly. He counted the seconds. In his past life, he'd forgotten how to count seconds. Back then, they counted sips of water. The helicopter landed on the Atlas 7 helipad at 6 in the morning on the 3rd day. Dan jumped down onto the grating and breathed in the salty air. The platform stood in the middle of the gray sea like the skeleton of a dead giant. Rust covered the railings and stairs with a reddish crust. The cranes were frozen in absurd poses. The windows of the living quarters were boarded up with plywood. The wind whistled through the empty pipelines. Hank climbed out after him and stopped at the edge of the platform. He scanned the platform and spat. He said it wasn't a facility, but a pile of scrap metal. He said you couldn't even make coffee here because there hadn't been any electricity for a year. Dan didn't answer. He looked at the platform and saw what Hank couldn't see. The system illuminated every structural element. Red zones pulsed in areas of critical wear. Yellow ones flickered exactly where Dan himself knew there were problems. But most importantly, he saw it without any system at all. He saw it with his own hands. 12 years on platforms like this. He knew where every bolt was located and which welds had been rushed in haste before an inspection. Dan walked silently toward the main staircase. Hank followed him, grumbling something about life insurance. They descended to the 2nd level. The corridor was dark. Dan turned on his flashlight and walked 30 steps to the distribution panel. He opened the panel. Everything inside was covered in dust. 12 fuses in a row, all blown. Dan pulled a pack of new fuses out of his pocket. He'd bought them yesterday at the electrical supply store for $48, $4 a piece. He began replacing them one by one. Hank stood behind him, shining the flashlight. He asked what good that would do. Dan replied that in 19, Chevron had installed the wrong model of fuses. All 12 had blown at the same time under load. The company decided the problem was in the main wiring and wrote off the platform, but the wiring was fine. The problem was those 12 pieces of copper and ceramic costing $4 each. Dan inserted the last fuse and placed his hand on the circuit breaker. He looked at Hank. Then he flipped the circuit breaker down. The platform came to life. Lights flashed on throughout the corridor. The fans hummed to life. Somewhere below, the pumps began to clatter. The radio in the control room squealed with static. Hank dropped his cigarette. It fell onto the grating and sank into a crack. He stood there with his mouth agape, watching as the ceiling lights came on one by one along the entire length of the corridor. Dan was already moving on. He went down to the third level toward the desalination module. The system bathed the unit in yellow light. He opened the side panel and found what he was looking for: a gasket on the inlet valve, a rubber washer the size of a coin, worn out and cracked. He replaced it with a new one from the same spare parts bag. The gasket cost $12. He closed the panel. He turned on the desalinator. The machine hummed to life. 20 minutes later, water began flowing from the faucet. Clean, fresh water. Dan cupped his hand and took a sip. In his past life, a liter of fresh water had cost as much as an ounce of gold. Now, the desalinator was producing 8 metric tons a day. The system updated the data. The facility's status rose from 34 to 39%. Dan smirked. $60 and 2 hours of work. That was the price difference between a dead platform and a living one. Hank caught up with him at the desalinator. He wasn't joking about scrap metal anymore. He looked at Dan with new eyes. He asked how Dan had known about the fuses. Dan replied that he'd worked on this platform for 6 years and had written the report on the problem himself. It was the truth, not the whole truth, but enough. Hank nodded. Then he asked what to do next. Dan spread out the to-do list on the table. 73 items for the next 2 weeks. First, check all 4 generators and get at least 2 of them running. Second, seal off the living quarters on the first level. 8 cabins, 2 people per cabin. Third, repair the crane on the upper deck. Fourth, install a satellite dish for communication with shore. Fifth, check the fire suppression system, and so on. Hank looked at the list and whistled. He said this would be 6 months worth of work for a crew of 10. Dan replied that they had 3 weeks and 2 hands, but there would be more soon. The next day, Dan returned to Houston and met with 3 people. The first was a mechanic named Raul Santos, 41 years old. He'd worked on oil rigs in Mexico for 10 years. He lost his job when the company went bankrupt. Dan found him through an old colleague from Shell. Raul agreed to work for double the going rate and free housing on the platform. The second was an electrician named Derek Matthews, 36 years old, a specialist in industrial electrical systems. He worked at the Navy dock in Norfolk until he quit due to a conflict with his superiors. Dan offered him complete autonomy and no bosses other than Dan himself. Derek thought it over for 2 days and agreed. The third was a nurse named Lena Torres, 28 years old. She had worked in the emergency room in Houston. She was burned out. She was looking for something far away from the city. Dan offered her the position of sole medical staff member at the offshore facility, complete with a full medical supply kit that he would procure himself. Lena asked how many people were on the platform. Dan replied that there were 5 for now, but there would soon be 30. She asked why so many people were needed on a decommissioned platform. Dan said he was preparing for a major hurricane. Hurricane season began in June, and that sounded plausible. All 3 arrived at the platform by the 10th day. Dan assigned the tasks. Raul took care of the generators. Of the 4, 2 turned out to be dead, but the other 2 were successfully started after replacing the fuel filters and oil. Derek checked the entire electrical wiring meter by meter. He found 14 breaks and 2 spots where the insulation had rotted away to the copper. By the 12th day, the platform's electrical system was running smoothly. Lena set up a medical station in the former drilling supervisor's cabin Dan had brought her $40,000 worth of medications from shore: antibiotics, painkillers, surgical kits, suture material, IV drips, everything that might be needed when the nearest hospital was 300 miles out at sea. During that time, Hank welded 13 cracks in the load-bearing structures and reinforced the railings on all levels. The platform had stopped creaking with every gust of wind. The system indicated a condition rating of 47%. Dan worked 18 hours a day. He woke up at 5 in the morning. He walked the length of the platform from top to bottom. He checked every joint. He replaced gaskets. He tightened bolts. He cleaned filters. His hands remembered every movement. His body worked on autopilot while his mind counted the days. 84 days until the ascent. 79 days. 73 days. At night, he lay in his cabin and stared at the ceiling. The system flickered blue in the corner of his vision, displaying the platform's schematics. He scrolled through the modules he could build. A hydroponic farm. A second-tier living quarters, a repair dock, aquaculture pens. Everything required resources, steel, composite materials, electronics, and hands, human hands. The system augmented the work, but didn't replace it. Without people, the platform would remain nothing more than a hunk of metal in the sea. Dan closed his eyes. Tomorrow he had to fly to Houston. A marine biologist would be giving a lecture at the university on seismic anomalies in the Mariana Trench. The biologist's name was Morgan Riley, and Dan knew for certain that she was right in every word. Dan and Hank arrived at the Atlas 7 and brought the platform back to life by replacing 12 fuses and 1 gasket. During the first 2 weeks, Dan assembled an initial crew of 5 and brought the platform's operational status up to 47%. The next goal was to find marine biologist Morgan Riley at her lecture at the University of Houston. Morgan Riley stood at the lectern and spoke about how the ocean was behaving strangely. The auditorium was half empty. About 20 people were there. Half of them were students who had come for credit. The other half were retirees who attended every free lecture in a row. Morgan didn't care. She showed slides with graphs of seismic activity in the Mariana Trench region over the past 3 years. The curves were rising sharply, abnormally. She explained that no existing model could account for this data, that the frequency of micro-earthquakes in the trench region had increased 40-fold over the past 18 months, that the temperature of the bottom layers had risen by 2 degrees, which spells disaster for deep-sea ecosystems, that the composition of the water at depth was changing, as if new water were entering the ocean, not from the surface, from below, from the mantle. The students were bored. One was playing on his phone, another was drawing in her notebook. Dan sat in the back row and listened to every word. He knew Morgan was right. He could see what would happen in 2 months when the fault finally opened completely. He could see the ocean level rising before his eyes, engulfing the continents. He could see ecosystems that had lived in total darkness for millions of years surfacing from the depths. Morgan finished her lecture. She packed up her laptop. No one asked a single question. She stepped out into the hallway. Dan stood up and followed her. He caught up with her by the elevator. She turned around, tall, dark hair, pulled back into a ponytail. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. She looked at him appraisingly. Dan said he'd listened to her lecture and that she was right. Morgan smirked and replied that if she were paid $1 for every person who told her she was right, she'd have bought herself a submarine by now. Dan said he had something better than a submarine, an oil rig 180 miles off the coast, and that in 60 days, what she'd talked about in her lecture would happen. Only the scale would be bigger than she thought. Morgan stopped smiling. She looked at him intently. She asked who he was. Dan replied that he was a mechanical engineer, 12 years on offshore platforms, Shell and Chevron. Morgan asked how he knew about the scale. Dan was silent for a second. Then he said he couldn't explain everything right now, but he could show her. He suggested she come to the platform and take a look, just one day. If she didn't like it, she'd be back in time for dinner. Morgan stood there looking at him. She'd seen men like this before, confident, with crazy ideas. Usually they wanted her to confirm their conspiracy theories about underwater UFOs or secret government experiments. But this one was different. He wasn't excited. He wasn't waving his arms around. He wasn't speaking loudly. He was calm, like someone who knows exactly what's going to happen and stopped being afraid a long time ago. Morgan said she'd think about it. Dan left her his business card and left. She called him back 2 days later. She said she agreed to take a look, but only because she had nothing else to do over the weekend. The helicopter picked her up at dawn on the 36th day. Morgan was silent the whole way. She stared out the window at the gray sea. When the platform appeared on the horizon, she leaned forward. Atlas 7 no longer looked like a skeleton. The living quarters on the first level glowed with light from the windows. 2 wind turbines stood on the upper deck. A service boat bobbed at the dock. A satellite communication antenna jutted out above the control room. The helicopter landed, and Morgan stepped out onto the deck. Dan met her with a mug of coffee, real coffee. She took the mug and let her gaze sweep over the platform. Hank was cooking something on the lower level. Sparks from the welding rained down like an orange shower. Raoul was clanging away with his tools by the generator. Derek was running a cable along the wall of the living quarters. Lena was hanging laundry on a line between 2 masts. The platform was alive. Morgan took a sip of coffee and said she was impressed. Then she asked why he needed a marine biologist on an oil rig. Dan led her to the 3rd level. There was an empty room there, a large one, 60 square meters, with wide windows overlooking the ocean. Dan said he planned to set up a laboratory there. Microscopes, analytical equipment, water sampling systems, everything needed to monitor the state of the ocean. Morgan looked at him. She asked why he wanted to monitor the ocean from an oil rig. Dan replied that soon the ocean would be the only world they had left, and they'll need someone who understands that world. Morgan was silent for a long time. Then she said he sounded like a madman, but madmen don't usually buy oil rigs or hire 6 people. Madmen yell on street corners, but he's building something. That's different. She asked about the terms. Dan offered her a salary and complete freedom to conduct research, housing on the platform, food, medical care, everything she needed. The only condition was to be there by mid-August. Morgan asked why specifically by mid-August. Dan looked her in the eyes. Then he said quietly that on August 16th, what she had described in her lecture would happen. The rift in the Mariana Trench would open completely, and the world would change forever. Morgan set her mug down on the table. Her hands weren't shaking. She was a scientist. She worked with data, not emotions. She asked how he knew the exact date. Dan replied that he couldn't say, not yet anyway. But the data she'd presented in her lecture was just the tip of the iceberg. The real picture was much worse. Morgan was silent for a minute. Then she said she needed a week to pack her things and wrap up her affairs at the university. Dan nodded. She flew out that same day. Dan went down to the empty room on the 3rd level and opened the system interface. Module library. He found what he was looking for. A Type 4 research module, marine biology laboratory, installation requirements, 30 square meters of available space, minimum, connection to the power grid, water supply, ventilation, resources, steel, glass, copper wiring. Dan didn't have everything he needed yet, but in 2 months, when the risers appeared in the ocean, he would gain access to resources that no one else in the world had. Bioluminescent glands, chitin from deep-sea creatures, enzymes that could replace industrial catalysts, and he needed someone who understood all of this. Morgan returned in 5 days instead of a week. She brought back 3 suitcases of equipment and 5 boxes of books. She set up in a cabin next to the lab and immediately got to work. She took water samples. She analyzed the composition. She plotted graphs. By the evening of the first day, she approached Dan and told him that the water in this area was already changing. The mineral content had risen by 7% compared to normal levels. This wasn't normal. It meant that something on a massive scale was happening beneath the ocean. Dan nodded. He knew. But every time someone on his team confirmed what he already knew, it gave him confidence. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't made up his past life. All of this was going to happen, and he would be ready. Dan found Morgan Riley at a lecture on seismic anomalies and convinced her to come to the platform. Morgan agreed to join the team and began researching the ocean. Her initial analyses confirmed that the composition of the water was already changing. A marine biology laboratory is planned for the platform, which will require biological resources from the resurfaced in the future. Day 58. 36 days until the rise. Dan sat at the table in the control room, looking at the list of names. Of the 11 people he wanted to find, 4 were already on the platform or had agreed to come. Morgan, Hank, Raul, Lena, but the remaining 7 were scattered throughout Houston and the surrounding area, and each of them required a separate approach. You can't just walk up to someone on the street and tell them that in a month the world will be submerged. They'd lock him up in a psychiatric hospital and the platform would be left without a commander. Dan rubbed his eyes and looked at the next name on the list, Yuna Kim, a chef from Busan. In her past life, she'd ended up on the Magellan by accident. She'd come to Houston for a cooking competition. The competition ended. She stayed another week to explore the city and found herself at the end of the world. On the tanker, she became indispensable. She cooked meals from whatever was available. Seaweed, fish, and canned goods past their expiration dates. She fed 200 people and never once complained. She died on the 381st day. Pneumonia. They didn't give her any medicine because someone decided she was stealing rations. Dan clenched his fists under the table. He found her restaurant, a small Korean eatery on the outskirts of Houston. 10 tables, red lanterns at the entrance, the smell of kimchi and grilled meat. Dan came in the evening and sat down at a corner table. He ordered kimchi jjigae. Yuna brought the order herself. She was short, she had a round face, her apron was splattered with sauce. She set the plate in front of him and smiled. Dan looked at her and lost his voice for a second. In a past life, he'd watched her fade away day by day. A cough that wouldn't go away, a fever, dark circles under her eyes. And nothing, not a single antibiotic pill, because to someone, she was just a disposable commodity. Dan came back the next evening, and the next, and the next, 7 evenings in a row. Each time, he ordered something new. Kalbitan, japchae, samgyeopsal, dak galbi. Yuna recognized him by his 3rd visit. By the 5th, she started sitting down for a minute to ask if he liked it. By the 6th, she brought out a dish that wasn't on the menu. She said it was her grandmother's recipe from Busan. Dan tasted it and said it was the best meal he'd had in 2 years. Yuna laughed and replied that he was exaggerating. She didn't know he meant it literally. On the 7th evening, Dan waited until the restaurant was empty. Yuna came out of the kitchen, drying her hands with a towel. Dan said it would sound strange, but he was willing to pay her a year's salary in advance if she'd get in his helicopter tomorrow morning and fly with him to see a certain place. If she didn't like it, he'd bring her back home in time for dinner. Yuna stopped drying her hands. She looked at him for a long time. Then she laughed and said something in Korean. Then she translated it. She said that usually men ask her out on a date, not to ride in a helicopter. Dan didn't smile. He said he needed the best chef he knew for a place where food would be more important than money, more important than weapons, more important than anything. Yuna stopped laughing. She saw something in his eyes, something she couldn't explain. He didn't seem like a rich eccentric with whims. He seemed like a man who had been hungry for a very long time and had finally found someone who knew how to feed him. She agreed. In the morning, the helicopter picked her up from the roof of her house. She clutched 2 bags to her chest. One contained clothes, the other contained knives. 24 knives in a special case, a gift from her grandfather. When she saw the platform from the air, she fell silent. When she entered the communal dining hall on the 2nd level, she stopped. The dining hall was empty. Long tables, benches, a large window overlooking the ocean, and a kitchen, a commercial kitchen with 3 stovetops and 2 ovens, a refrigerator, a freezer, shelves for spices. Everything was new. Everything was shiny. Una turned to Dan. She asked how many people this kitchen was designed for. Dan replied that right now it was for 8, but soon it would be 200. Una walked around the kitchen. She ran her hand over the countertop. She opened the oven. She peeked into the refrigerator. Then she looked at Dan and said the fridge was empty. Dan smiled, his first smile in several weeks. He said it was her job to fill it up, and his job was to make sure she never ran out of food. Una nodded. She took off her jacket. She pulled the knives out of her bag. She laid them out on the table. And an hour later, the kitchen smelled so good that Hank came up from the engine room without even asking for directions. Meanwhile, Dan was working on the next name on the list, alongside Una, Haley Chen, 27 years old, yacht captain and scuba diving instructor. He found her through the Galveston Bay Yacht Club database. The club went bankrupt 3 months ago. Haley was left with $80,000 in debt and no job. She was moonlighting as a scuba diving instructor on the beach for cash. Dan drove out to the beach to see her on Thursday. She was sitting on an upside-down boat, mending her wetsuit, tanned, short hair, an anchor tattoo on her ankle. Dan walked up and said he wanted to hire a captain. Haley didn't even look up. She replied that she didn't have a yacht. It's hard to be a captain without a boat. Dan said there would be a boat, and not just a yacht, a whole fleet. But first, he needed someone who knew how to navigate the open sea and wasn't afraid of the deep. Haley looked up. She looked at him. She asked if he was serious or if this was some kind of prank. Dan pulled a check out of his pocket. $80,000, the amount of her debt. He placed the check on the deck of the boat and said it was in advance. The debt was paid off. In exchange, a 1-year contract, work at an offshore facility, full support. She would command everything that sailed within the platform's operational radius. Haley took the check. She looked at the amount, then at Dan, then back at the check. She asked if he was a drug lord or an oil tycoon. Dan replied that he was neither, just a man who knows that good captains will soon be needed. Haley folded the check and slipped it into the pocket of her shorts. She said he was strange, but strange people are usually more interesting than normal ones. She arrived at the platform 3 days. The first thing she did was inspect the dock. She said the dock was crap and needed to be rebuilt. Dan agreed. Haley grabbed her tools and got to work. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for instructions. She just saw what needed to be done and did it. Dan watched her from the upper deck and thought that in a past life, they'd never met. He doesn't know what became of her after the rise. He doesn't know if she lived or died. But he knows he needs someone who isn't afraid of water. Because soon there will be more water than anyone could ever imagine. By the 60th day, 9 people were living on the platform. Dan, Hank, Raul, Derek, Lena, Morgan, Una, and Haley. And the system showed a status of 53%. 34 days until the end of the world. Dan found and recruited Chef Una Kim and Captain Haley Chin to the platform. Una took over the kitchen and began feeding the crew. Haley set about renovating the dock. There are now 9 people on the platform, and the facility's status has risen to 53%. 34 days remain until the rise, day 64, 30 days until the rise. Dan was standing at the bar in the establishment Dark Horse on the southern outskirts of Houston. The beer in front of him was untouched. He was waiting. He knew this woman. He'd seen her in a past life. She'd been a doctor on the Magellan. The only doctor for 600 people. She hadn't slept for 3 days straight. She'd stitched up wounds with twine from sacks when they ran out of surgical silk. She'd set bones without anesthesia. And when Dan was lying on the floor with 3 bullets in his chest, she was the one who tried to save him. He remembered her face. Leaning over him, her hands covered in blood, his blood, and her voice. The quiet, steady voice with which she told him that everything would be all right, even though they both knew it wouldn't be. Sarah Whitehorse was sitting in the far corner of the bar, alone. In front of her was a glass of whiskey, half empty, dark hair down to her shoulders, a thin face, a tattoo on her forearm, a medical caduceus wrapped in barbed wire.
Dan recognized that tattoo instantly. He'd seen it when Sarah rolled up her sleeves to perform surgery on the Magellan. He grabbed his beer and walked over to her table. He sat down across from her. Sarah looked up. A cold stare. She didn't smile or ask who he was. She just waited.
Dan said he was looking for a doctor for an off-grid facility. Sarah took a sip of whiskey. She asked what kind of facility. Dan replied that it was an offshore platform, 180 miles from shore. She would be the only doctor there. 30 people. Soon there would be more. She'd have her own hospital, and no one would interfere with her. The pay was double the Army rate. Sarah set down her glass. She looked at him. She asked why he'd come to her specifically. There are hundreds of doctors in Houston. Dan was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said he'd seen her at work. Sarah narrowed her eyes. She asked where. Dan realized he'd almost let the cat out of the bag. He couldn't tell the truth. He couldn't say that he'd seen her on a tanker in a world that hadn't yet come to pass. He said he'd read about her service in Afghanistan field surgery with zero supplies. That was exactly the kind of experience he needed. Sarah finished her whiskey. She turned the glass upside down. That was her way of saying she was done drinking. She said she'd left the Army 2 years ago. PTSD, insomnia, alcohol problems. She wasn't the best candidate. Dan replied that he didn't need the best candidate. He needed a doctor who wouldn't crack when everything around them was falling apart. A doctor who had already seen the worst and come out on top. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she quietly asked what he had in mind. Dan said he was preparing for the worst. He couldn't say exactly what it was, but when it happened, she'd need a job, a real job. Not a bar, not insomnia, not a glass of whiskey in an empty corner. A job worth waking up for. Sarah was silent for a full minute. From across the table, they could hear the bartender wiping glasses. Then she said she needed 3 days. Dan gave her his phone number and the address of the helipad. She called 2 days later, not 3. While Dan was working with Sarah, Hank finished reinforcing the northern support on the platform. Morgan set up an automatic water sampling sensor and brought Dan printouts of the data every evening. The mineral content in the water continued to rise. Morgan said that if this trend continued, the chemical composition of the ocean in this area would change irreversibly in 2 months. Dan nodded. He knew. In 2 months, the ocean's chemistry would change. Not just in this area. Meanwhile, Una had turned the dining hall into the heart of life on the platform. 3 times a day, everyone gathered around the long table. Una cooked with whatever they brought from shore. Rice, fish, vegetables. But even simple dishes became something special in her hands. Hank, who had eaten in silence and left right away during the first few days, now lingered at the table. He told tall tales about shipyards. Raul taught Lena how to play Mexican poker. Derek argued with Morgan about the physics of electromagnetic fields. The worksite was turning into something resembling a home. Dan noticed this, but didn't say anything out loud. Every evening after dinner, he would go up to the upper deck and watch the sunset. The orange sun sank into the gray sea, quiet, beautiful. In a month, this sunset would look different. The sun would set into an ocean that had swallowed the continents, and the silence would signify not peace, but the absence of people. Sarah arrived on the 68th day, 26 days until the ascent. She stepped out of the helicopter with a single backpack, a military habit. Everything she needed fit into one backpack. Dan showed her the medical unit, 2 rooms on the first level, former drillers' quarters. He had converted them over the past week. An operating table, a sterilizer, 2 cabinets with medications, an autoclave, a portable X-ray machine, a blood transfusion kit, an oxygen concentrator. Sarah walked slowly around the room. She opened every cabinet. She checked the expiration dates on every package. She counted the vials. It took 40 minutes. Then she turned to Dan and said that there was more equipment here than she'd had at the field hospital in Kandahar. Dan replied that there would soon be more. He'd ordered a surgical kit and an ultrasound machine. Delivery in a week. Sarah nodded. Then she asked why he was preparing for war in the middle of a peaceful ocean. Dan looked at her. He saw something familiar in her eyes, the same shadow he saw in the mirror every morning. The shadow of a man who had seen too much and couldn't forget it. He replied quietly that he wasn't preparing for war. He was preparing to survive. They're two different things. Sarah didn't ask any further questions. She unpacked her backpack. She hung her jacket in the closet. She laid out her instruments on the table, scalpels, clamps, needle holders, every item in its place, just like in an operating room, just like in war. Dan left her alone. He went up to the control room and opened the system. The interface displayed the platform's status: 56%. Population, 10 out of 30. Resources were limited, but the structure was growing stronger. Every new person didn't just add another pair of working hands. Every new person changed the platform. Una built the dining hall. Morgan set up the lab. Haley remodeled the dock. Sarah would now build the hospital. Everyone was building their own little piece of the world. That was where the strength lay, not in a single engineer who knew how to fix everything, but in 10 people, each of whom was best at doing one specific thing. Dan scrolled through the system's module library. He needed to decide what to build first: a hydroponic farm. Without it, there would be nothing to eat 6 months after the rise. He had the seeds. 40 metric tons had been purchased and were stored in a warehouse in Houston, waiting to be transported. But the farm required space, light, water, and people who know how to grow plants. That was the next name on the list. But Dan wasn't ready for that one, because the man he wanted to find wasn't in Houston. He was in Austin, and there was a problem with him. In a past life, this man had saved Dan's life long before Magellan. And Dan didn't know how to approach him without giving too much away. 25 days until the ascent. Dan stood on the upper deck and counted 10 people, 3 water desalinators, 1 is working, 2 need repairs, 4 months worth of fuel, a year's supply of medicine, 3 months worth of food, seeds in storage in Houston, solar panels ordered, wind turbines installed, communications working, safety nets not yet installed, 2 out of 4 generators, 8 living quarters, need 12 more. We need 20 more people. We need so many other things that it made your head spin if you thought about it for too long. Dan didn't think about it for too long. He went down to the workshop and grabbed a 24-millimeter wrench. He went to fix the second water desalinator. His hands knew what to do. His mind was counting the days, 24 days until the ascent. Dan was flying to Austin in a rented helicopter, thinking about the man he was going to find. His name was Tom Grady, 58 years old, a former agricultural engineer with the Department of Agriculture. For 20 years, he had designed hydroponic systems for military bases in the deserts. Then he retired and moved to Austin to grow tomatoes in his backyard. In his past life, Dan had met him 7 months after the rise. Tom was drifting alone on a sailboat with a greenhouse made of polyethylene stretched over a frame of oars. He grew greens right on the deck. Tomatoes, lettuce, peas. In the middle of a dead ocean where people were killing each other over a can of stewed meat, this man was growing food out of nothing. Dan picked him up on the Magellan. Tom fed 200 people fresh tomatoes. Grown men were crying over the taste of a fresh tomato. Tom died 2 months later. A heart attack. He was 60, no medicine, no doctor, nothing. This time, Dan has a doctor. He has medicine, and he has 38 metric tons of seeds that Tom can turn into food. The helicopter landed at a private helipad outside the city. Dan took a taxi to the suburbs. He found the right address, a white house with a green roof. In the backyard was a polycarbonate greenhouse. Inside the greenhouse stood a thin, gray-haired man in a straw hat, tying up tomato plants. Dan opened the gate and stepped into the yard. Tom turned around. He looked at the stranger from under the brim of his hat. Dan introduced himself. He said he was a mechanical engineer and that he needed a hydroponics specialist for an offshore facility. Tom took off his gloves. He asked what kind of facility it was. Dan explained, a platform in the Gulf of Mexico, self-sufficient. They needed a food growing system for 200 people, a closed-loop system, hydroponics, aquaponics, vertical racks. Tom smirked. He said that for 200 people, they'd need at least 600 square meters of space, plus light, plus water, plus nutrient solutions, plus temperature control. On an oil platform, that's almost impossible. Dan replied that they'd have the space. They'd have the lighting. They already have the water, 8 metric tons of fresh water per day. And Tom would formulate the nutrient solutions himself because he was the leading expert on the subject in the country. Tom looked at him with interest. He asked how Dan knew him. Dan said he'd read his publications on hydroponic systems for extreme conditions. An article in the Journal of Military Agriculture from the 22nd year. A closed-loop system for Arctic bases. Tom raised his eyebrows. About 12 people had read that article. He was sure he remembered every single one of them. Dan shrugged and said he had a good memory for useful things. They talked for 3 hours. Tom asked questions about the area, about lighting, about energy sources, about the water composition. Dan answered every one. He knew the answers because the system stored the specifications for the hydroponic farm module and because he'd worked on such platforms for 12 years. Tom listened and nodded. Then he fell silent. He took off his hat. He twirled it in his hands. He said he was 58, that his left knee hurt every morning, that he was retired and doing well. The tomatoes were growing. His wife had died 3 years ago. His children had moved away. He was at peace. Why would he want to go to a rusty platform in the middle of the sea? Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly that tomatoes in the backyard are nice, but tomatoes in the middle of the ocean, for people who've forgotten what they taste like, are something else. That's what makes it worth getting up in the morning. Tom put his hat back on. He looked at his greenhouse, then at Dan. He said he needed a week to think it over. Dan replied that he didn't have a week. He had 3 days. Tom asked why the rush. Dan said it was hurricane season. They had to get it done before the first storm. Tom thought about it for 2 days. He called on the 3rd. He said he'd come, but only if he was given full control over the farm. No orders from above. He'd decide what to plant, when to plant it, and how to plant it. Dan agreed without hesitation. While Dan was in Austin, the first incident occurred on the platform. Haley set out on a patrol run in a boat 15 miles from the base. She was checking the route Dan planned to use to deliver cargo from the shore. On the way back, the boat's engine stalled. Haley checked the fuel system. Clear. She checked the electrical system. Everything was fine. The engine simply wouldn't start. She reported the problem over the radio. Dan was in Austin. Raoul answered. He offered to send a second boat. Haley said she could handle it herself. She dove alongside the boat to check the propeller, and underwater she saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something big. Dark. It was moving slowly at a depth of 15 meters, the size of a minivan. Haley surfaced. She climbed back on board. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know what it was. A dolphin, a shark, something else. It was too big for any marine animal she knew of in these waters. She waited 10 minutes. The creature was gone. The engine started on its own. Haley returned to the platform and told Morgan what had happened. Morgan listened intently. Then she said that in recent weeks, unusual activity among deep-sea fauna had been recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. Animals that normally live at depths of 1,000 meters were rising to the surface. No one understood why. Morgan understood. She didn't say it out loud, but she had already linked her data on seismic activity to the changes in the behavior of marine life. Something was pushing up from below. Something was pushing the deep-sea ecosystems upward. Dan returned to the platform 21 days before the rise. Haley told him about the creature underwater. Dan listened calmly, too calmly. Haley noticed this. She asked why he wasn't surprised. Dan replied that deep-sea fauna rise to the surface due to changes in pressure and temperature at depth. It's a normal process. Haley said that the minivan under her boat wasn't a normal process. Dan looked at her and said very seriously that she shouldn't go out on the boat alone. Ever again. Only in pairs, and only with weapons on board. Haley wanted to ask why, but something in his voice stopped her. She nodded. That same day, Dan went down to the wheelhouse and opened the system. He found the protective net module. Underwater nets, made of steel cable with half-meter mesh. They're installed around the perimeter of the platform at a depth of 5 to 20 meters. Installation requirements: 4 metric tons of steel cable, 300 meters of chain, and 40 anchors. Dan didn't have 4 metric tons of steel cable, but he knew where to get it. At the shipyard in Galveston, which was closing in 2 weeks. A clearance sale, cable priced like scrap metal. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. One more trip, one more receipt. He was running out of money. Of the $340,000, less than 30 remained. Crew salaries, helicopter fuel, equipment purchases, seeds, medications, everything had eaten up the budget. But money would soon lose its meaning. In 21 days, pieces of paper with numbers on them would become useless. The only things that would matter would be what you could touch with your hands. Steel, water, food, people. Dan closed his notebook. He went up on deck. The sun was setting. Una was calling everyone to dinner from the kitchen. Hank was cursing on the lower deck because Raoul had dropped a wrench on his foot. Morgan was sitting by the lab window, writing something in a notebook. Haley was washing the boat at the dock, humming to herself. Sarah was smoking on the staircase between the second and third levels. 10 people on a derelict platform in the middle of the sea. And in 3 weeks, they'll be among the few living people on the planet. Dan found agricultural engineer Tom Grady in Austin and convinced him to come to the platform to set up a hydroponic farm. Haley spotted a large deep-sea creature underwater, the first sign of deep-sea fauna surfacing. Dan's money is almost up, but he's planning one last purchase of steel cable for the protective nets. 21 days until the rise. 18 days until the rise. Dan has made 4 trips to shore over the past 3 days. The first trip was to the shipyard in Galveston. He bought 4.5 metric tons of steel cable and 320 meters of chain for $11,000. The salesman at the shipyard looked at him as if he were crazy. He asked why one person would need so much. Dan replied that he was building fish cages for aquaculture. The salesman shrugged and loaded the cable onto the supply platform that Dan had rented for 3 days. The second trip was to a warehouse in Houston. 40 metric tons of seeds, wheat, rice, soybeans, peas, beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, lettuce, potato tubers, fish feed grass seeds. Tom compiled the list himself. Each item listed with its exact weight and variety. Loading took 6 hours. The third trip was to an Army warehouse in San Antonio. Through Sarah's former colleague, Dan found a man who was selling decommissioned Army equipment, a generator, 2 sets of solar panels, heavy-duty tents, a thermal imager, 3 pairs of night vision goggles, Army MREs for 400 person days. The fourth trip was the most important. Dan flew to a small town north of Houston. That's where Emma Klein lived. 22 years old, an MIT student spending her summer break with her parents, majoring in industrial automation. Dan knew about her from his past life. After the rise, a fragment of program code had been making the rounds on the tankers. It was firmware for industrial controllers that allowed generators and pumps to be controlled from a single terminal. This code saved dozens of ships from accidents. The author of the code was unknown, just the initials EK and a date. Dan found the author 6 months later, Emma Klein. She had written this firmware as a course project during her sophomore year at MIT. She'd uploaded it to an industrial automation forum. 15 downloads in 2 years. No one had paid any attention to it. After the rise, this code became currency. Dan pulled up to the Klein's house at 2 o'clock of the day. A typical suburban house, a white fence, a neatly mowed lawn. Emma's mother answered the door. A plump woman in an apron. Dan introduced himself and said he was from a tech company and was looking for an intern for the summer program. Her mother called for Emma. She came down the stairs a minute later, thin-framed glasses, a t-shirt with a video game logo. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail. She looked at Dan warily. He didn't look like a recruiter from a tech company, too tanned, hands that were too rough. Dan asked to speak with her alone. They went out to the backyard. They sat down at a plastic table by the pool. Dan said he'd found her through some code she'd posted on an industrial automation forum 2 years ago. firmware for controllers. He named the exact file name and version. Emma sat up straight. She asked how he knew about this code. Almost no one had downloaded it. Dan replied that he was one of 15 and that this code was genius. He offered her an internship at a real industrial facility, an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. Fully automated sensors, controllers, control systems for the power grid, and desalination plants. A senior developer's salary. Emma was silent. Then she said quietly that her parents wanted her to become a doctor or a lawyer. They considered programming a frivolity. She had never received a job offer as a programmer, not a single one. Dan looked her in the eyes and said that on his platform, her code would sustain the lives of 30 people. If her program went down, people would be left without power, without water, without protection. This isn't a frivolity. It's the most important job there is. Emma took off her glasses and wiped them with the hem of her t-shirt. Her hands were trembling slightly. She asked when to start. Dan said tomorrow. She looked at the house, at the kitchen window where her mother was standing. Then she turned to Dan and said she needed to pack her things. And the cats. She had 2 cats. They were coming with her. Dan nodded. The cats were coming. Emma arrived at the platform 16 days before the rise with 2 suitcases of equipment and a carrier from which 2 cheeky faces peered out. A ginger cat and a gray cat. Una saw the cats and squealed with joy. She grabbed the ginger one and hugged it close. The ginger cat's name was Kalmar. The gray one was Shell. Emma had named them that when she was 16 and fascinated by marine biology. Morgan appraised the names. Hank said that cats on the platform were a bad omen. Haley replied that the real bad omen was the absence of cats on any offshore facility.
They argued for 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Emma was already sitting in the server room, connecting her laptop to the platform's control system.
4 hours later, she wrote her first script. Automatic monitoring of all generators, with alerts for overheating and drops in oil pressure. 8 hours later, she connected the desalination unit's sensors to the central control panel. 12 hours later, Dan could see the status of every system on the platform on a single screen in the bridge. Raoul walked into the bridge and saw the panel. He stopped. He said that in 20 years of working on platforms, he'd never once seen anyone set up a proper monitoring system. Usually, it costs $500,000 and takes half a year. Emma did it in half a day for free. Dan knew she was capable of more, much more, but for now it was enough. 14 days until the ascent, 12 people on the platform. Tom arrived the day before and immediately began designing the farm. He walked through all the available spaces, measured the area, checked the ventilation, calculated the distance to water and light sources. A day later, he presented the plan to Dan. 3 zones, the first on the second level. Vertical racks for greens and herbs. 200 square meters, the second on the roof of the residential block. An open area for crops that need direct sunlight. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers. The third in the hold below the main deck. Mushrooms. They don't need light, just humidity and temperature. Tom said that at full capacity, the farm would be able to feed 150 people. Not luxurious, but enough to keep from starving. For 200, a second zone on the neighboring platform would be needed. Dan nodded. The neighboring platform, Poseidon 2, was located 40 miles to the northeast. Also decommissioned. Also dead. But that was for later. Right now, the main thing was to get Atlas 7 ready in time. 10 days until the ascent. Dan gathered the team in the dining hall. 12 people sat at a long table. Una placed a pot of stewed meat and rice in the center. Dan stood up and said that 10 more people would be arriving on the platform in the coming days. Engineers, technicians, builders, people he'd hired for a long-term contract. The platform was transitioning to autonomous mode. Supplies from shore will stop in a week. Everything needed must be here by then. Hank asked why the supplies were being cut off. Dan replied that a powerful hurricane was forecast, a category they'd never seen before. He wants everyone to be safe on the platform rather than out at sea. Morgan looked at him over the rim of her mug. She didn't believe in the hurricane. She knew what was happening underwater, but she said nothing. Hank was silent too. He didn't believe in the hurricane, but he trusted Dan. In 3 months on the job, he'd seen enough to understand. This man knows something the rest of us don't. Every move he makes sense. Every purchase, every hire, every decision. Hank didn't understand how Dan knew this, but he saw the results. The dead platform had come back to life. 8 metric tons of fresh water a day, electricity, food, shelter, medicine, communications. If Dan says we need to prepare for a hurricane, then we need to prepare. Hank finished his meat and went to cook. The others silently followed his lead. Everyone went about their business. Yuna washed the dishes and hummed a Korean song. Kalmar slept on a warm pipe near the ceiling. Oboloshka sat on Emma's lap in the server room and purred while she wrote code. Dan stood on the upper deck and looked south. There, beyond the horizon, was Houston, the city where he was born, the city where he had lived for 34 years. In 10 days, that city would be underwater, and there was nothing he could do about it. Dan made his final purchases and brought agricultural engineer Tom Grady and programmer Emma Klein aboard the platform. Tom designed a 3-zone farm capable of feeding 150 people. Emma spent half a day creating a monitoring system for the entire platform. The team has grown to 12 people. Dan announced the transition to autonomous mode, citing the approach of a powerful hurricane. 10 days until the rise. 7 days until the rise. 22 people on the platform. Over the past week, Dan has brought in 10 new people. 3 welders from Houston, 2 electricians from Dallas, a diesel mechanic from New Orleans, a carpenter from Corpus Christi, a crane operator from Beaumont, and 2 just plain strong guys who were willing to work for a roof over their heads and 3 meals a day. Dan hired them quickly. There was no time for long conversations. He offered simple terms: a 1-year contract, housing, food, and a salary. The work was hard but fair. 8 out of 10 agreed right away. It took a whole day to convince the other 2. Yuna fed everyone. The cafeteria was now running 3 shifts: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Yuna got up at 4 in the morning and went to bed at 11 at night. She didn't complain. She whirled around the kitchen like a whirlwind. She would scold them in Korean. When someone didn't finish their meal, she'd smack Hank with a towel. When he tried to sneak food between meals, Hank grumbled, but obeyed. Everyone obeyed Yuna in the kitchen. It was her territory. Emma expanded the monitoring system. Now every sensor on the platform transmitted data in real time to the central screen in the bridge. Temperature, pressure, water levels in the tanks, generator status, wind speed. She wrote a program that warned of potential malfunctions 2 hours before they occurred. Raoul said it was magic. Emma replied that it was statistical analysis of time series, and there was nothing magical about it. Raoul said that when a woman in glasses says things like that, it's definitely magic. Tom started the first batch of seedlings. The vertical racks on second level were filled with trays of soil and seeds. LED lights flooded the room with violet light. Tom walked between the racks, checking the humidity, the temperature, and the soil's pH. He talked to the plants, quietly and seriously, just like with patients. Hank said the old man was crazy. Morgan replied that talking to plants raises the level of carbon dioxide in their immediate environment, which could theoretically speed up photosynthesis. Hank looked at her and said that now there were 2 crazy people. Morgan smiled. Dan, meanwhile, was setting up the safety nets. Haley was helping with the underwater work. She dived beneath the platform and secured anchors to the supports. The work was hard and dangerous. Visibility underwater had dropped over the last few days. Morgan explained that this was due to the increased concentration of suspended particles. The mineral composition was changing faster than she had expected. Haley would dive down and resurface each time with new stories. She had seen fish that shouldn't have been at that depth, deep-sea anglerfish at 30 meters. Something wasn't right. These fish live at depths of 1,000 meters and don't rise any higher. If they were here, it meant something down below was pushing them upward. Dan listened and said nothing. 5 days until the ascent. Dan sat alone in the wheelhouse. It was 2 a.m. Everyone was asleep. Only Kalmar sat on the table nearby, washing his paw. Dan stared at the system interface. Platform status, 64%. Population, 22 out of 100. Resources, 4 months' worth of fuel, unlimited water, 3 months' worth of food, plus a farm that will start yielding crops in 6 weeks, a year's supply of medication, ammunition, 3 hunting rifles, 1 harpoon, 2 pistols. That's not enough. Catastrophically insufficient. In his past life, Dan had seen what happens when people lose hope. Weapons become the only recourse. He ran his hand over the system. Defense systems module, turrets, searchlights, sirens, all of it required resources he didn't yet have. Steel, electronics, composite materials, all of that would appear when the ocean brought to the surface those who lived in its depths, the surfacers. Dan knew more about them than anyone else in the world. He knew what they looked like, how they hunted, how they moved, and he knew that every creature he killed meant resources. Chitin that could replace steel, bioluminescent glands that provided light without electricity, enzymes that sped up desalination tenfold. The system would break down every body into its components, but to do that, he first had to survive the initial encounter. The cat meowed and rubbed against his hand. Dan scratched the cat behind the ear. In his past life, he hadn't had a cat. There hadn't been a cafeteria that smelled of Korean cuisine. There was no lab with a smart woman who understood the ocean. There was no hospital with a doctor who never gave up. There was no server room with a programmer who talked to cats more than she did to people. There was nothing but a rusty tanker and fear. This time would be different. 3 days until the rise. Morgan came to Dan's wheelhouse with some printouts. Her face was ashen, her hands were trembling slightly. She placed the papers on the table and said that the data didn't fit any of the models. Seismic activity beneath the Mariana Trench had increased 200-fold over the past 2 weeks. The temperature of the bottom layers had risen by 11 degrees. The composition of the water was changing, as if the ocean were receiving an influx from another source, from the mantle. She looked at Dan. He wasn't surprised. He looked at her calmly, like someone who had long known what she had just discovered. Morgan sat down in a chair. She asked quietly what would happen. Dan was silent for 10 seconds. Then he said that in 3 days, global sea levels would rise by 340 meters in 72 hours. New York will be submerged. Tokyo, Shanghai, all coastal cities. The continents will be flooded. 4% of the Earth's population will survive. Morgan listened without moving. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't yell that he was crazy. She was a scientist. She looked at her data. The data confirmed every word he said. When he fell silent, she sat there for another minute. Then she looked up and asked one thing. Why hadn't he told her sooner? Dan replied that if he'd said it on the first day, she would have left and he would have lost the best marine biologist he knew. Morgan stood up. She walked over to the window. She looked out at the ocean. The dark water stretched beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there, beneath that water, the Earth's mantle was tearing apart. She turned and said she needed to prepare the lab for what was to come. If the ocean changed, she needed to understand exactly how, what kind of water, what kind of organisms, what kind of toxins. Dan nodded. Morgan walked out. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She just went to work. 2 days until the rise, Dan went up to the upper deck. Sunset, the sky was ablaze with orange and red. Una brought him coffee, real coffee, hot. She sat down next to him and silently gazed at the horizon. Then she quietly asked if it was true what people were saying. Morgan had told Sarah. Sarah had told Lena. Lena had told everyone. The news had spread in 2 hours. Dan looked at Yuna. He asked how she was doing. Yuna took a sip of coffee. She said there's a saying in Busan, when the sea takes something away, it always brings something in return. She paused. Then she added that if the world were to sink, she would feed those who managed to swim to safety. It was the only thing she knew how to do, and she would do it well. Dan clutched his mug with both hands. In a past life, Yuna had said almost the same thing on the deck of the Magellan, only back then, instead of coffee, it had been boiling water, and instead of a sunset, there was a gray haze. One day before the rise, Dan gathered everyone on the upper deck. 22 people stood in a semicircle. Their faces were serious. They already knew. Dan said that tomorrow the world would change, that the water would rise and not recede, that they were on this platform because he'd been preparing for this for 3 months, that they water, food, electricity, medicine, communication, and each other. He said it would be hard, that there would be storms and famine and people who would want to take what they had. But this platform would stand firm because he knew every bolt on it, and because every person on this deck knew their job. He fell silent. Silence, only the wind and the waves. Then Hank stepped forward and said that when Dan had called him to this rusty old vessel 3 months ago, he thought the boss was crazy. Now, he thinks the boss was the only sane person in town. Hank looked at the others and said he had no wife and no children. His family was his welding machine and this platform. And if anyone tried to take them away, he'd personally weld that person a stainless steel coffin. Yuna snorted. She said stainless steel was too valuable a material for coffins. It would be better to weld a pot out of it. A few people laughed. The tension eased slightly. Dan looked at the sunset. The orange sun was touching the horizon. The last sunset of the old world. August 16th, 2027, day 0. Dan woke up at 4 in the morning from a vibration, not from a sound, from a vibration that traveled through the floor, the walls, and the platform's frame, deep, low, as if someone had struck the ocean floor with a fist the size of a city. He jumped out of his bunk and slipped on his boots. He ran out into the corridor. The system was pulsing red in the corner of his eye. Seismic activity critical. Seafloor deformation detected. Estimated time until sea level rise. 12 hours. Dan ran to the bridge. Emma was already there. She was sitting in front of the screen in her pajamas, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose. The shell was sleeping on her lap. Graphs were flashing across the screen. All of the platform's sensors were showing anomalies. The water pressure beneath the supports was rising. The ocean temperature was climbing. Acoustic sensors were picking up a low-frequency hum from the depths. Emma turned to Dan and said quietly, "This is it." Dan nodded. He grabbed the radio and called a general assembly. 5 minutes later, all 22 people were standing in the mess hall. Their faces were sleepy and frightened. The vibration wouldn't stop. The glasses on the table were trembling slightly. The coffee in Yuna's mug was rippling. Dan said briefly, "It started." They had 12 hours until the first rise in water level. During that time, they needed to do 3 things. First, secure everything that could shift. Cargo in the warehouse, equipment in the workshop, shelving on the farm. Second, check the lower levels for leaks. If the water rises 340 meters, the lower sections of the platform will be subjected to a load they aren't designed to handle. Third, switch all communications to the emergency frequency. Listen to everything, every signal, every distress call, but don't respond. Don't respond yet. Hank asked why they shouldn't respond. Dan said that in the first few hours after the rise began, the airwaves would be chaotic. Hundreds of ships would be screaming for help. If they responded, every vessel within a 500-mile radius would head their way, and the platform couldn't hold 500 people. It could hold 50, maybe 70, but not 500. Silence. Hank lowered his head. He understood. Raoul clenched his fists. Lena closed her eyes. Yuna said something quietly in Korean that no one understood. Then she translated it. She said that at sea, you can't save everyone. You can only save those you can reach with your hand. Dan nodded. Then he said that everyone knew their job. And he sent everyone to their stations. The next 12 hours were the longest of his life, for the second time. Dan walked the length of the platform from top to bottom. He checked every fastener, every bolt, every latch. The system highlighted the weak spots, a yellow mark on the third support. He climbed down and tightened 4 nuts. The yellow turned green. A red alert on the weld seam of the deck railing. Hank was already there, welding. Sparks flew into the gray sea. At noon, the water began to rise. Not a wave, not a tsunami. The water level simply began to rise, slowly, inexorably. Morgan stood at the railing and looked at the scale Dan had painted on the platform support 3 weeks ago. White paint, markings every meter. At noon, the water was at the 0 mark. By 1 p.m., it was at 2 meters. By 3 p.m., at 7 meters. By 6 p.m., at 25 meters. Morgan recorded the level every hour. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice was steady as she dictated the numbers over the radio. She's a scientist. She documents even when she's documenting the end of the world. By sunset, the horizon had changed. Dan stood on the upper deck and looked east. Where there had once been a thin line of the Louisiana coastline, there was now only water. The coastline had vanished. He knew what was happening on the shore right now. He'd seen it in his past life through fragments of radio transmissions. Houston is flooded. Galveston is completely underwater. New Orleans vanished within the first 3 hours. A wave of panic. Millions of people are fleeing inland, but there's nowhere to run. The water moves faster than a person. The radios were drowned out by screams by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Hundreds of voices on every frequency. Pleas for help. Coordinates of sinking ships. Screams. Crying. Static. Dan ordered the speaker system in the bridge to be turned off. Emma recorded every transmission onto the hard drive, every voice, every message. She did it in silence. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her hands remained steady on the keyboard. Obaloshka sat on her lap, not moving a muscle. Una was feeding everyone. She didn't stop for a single minute. Lunch was ready by noon, dinner by 6. When Hank said he wasn't hungry, she set a plate in front of him and told him he would eat because a hungry welder is a dead welder. Hank ate. Sarah set up an emergency medical station in the dining hall. 4 first aid kits, a splint, bandages, IVs. She knew there wouldn't be any physical injuries, but shock is an injury too. She went around to each person one by one, checked their pulse, their blood pressure. She spoke softly and calmly, in an even voice, that very voice that makes grown men cry. 2 new workers actually did start crying. Sarah gave them water. She told them it was okay to cry. What wasn't okay was pretending nothing was happening. Night. The water had risen 80 meters. The lower level of the platform was humming under the pressure. Dan went down there with a flashlight. He checked the bulkheads. The seams were holding. The supports were holding. The structure creaked but didn't give way. It was designed for depths of up to 120 meters. They had a margin of safety. The system confirmed it. Structural integrity at 71%. Acceptable. He went back upstairs. Haley was standing at the railing, looking down. The water had risen to the level of the pier's main deck. Another 5 meters and the pier would be submerged. She said she'd move the boat to the upper mooring. Dan nodded. Then he told her she needed to get some sleep. Haley replied that she couldn't sleep while the world was sinking. Dan replied that the world would keep sinking for another 2 days. If she didn't get some sleep now, she'd be useless in 2 days. Haley looked at him. Then she nodded and went into her cabin. Dan was left alone on deck. The night sky was clear. The stars shone brightly. A dim light emanated from the depths of the ocean. Blue, flickering, bioluminescence. Something enormous was moving beneath the surface. Not just one, many. Dozens of light sources, maybe hundreds. They were rising. The surfacing creatures were coming up along with the water. Dan stood and watched. In his past life, he'd seen his first riser on the 4th day after the rise. An 8-meter-long mutant squid with a chitinous shell. and tentacles as thick as a human thigh. It had crawled onto the tanker's deck and dragged 3 people overboard. This time Dan would be ready, but not today. Today, he just had to get through the night. On the 3rd day after the rise began, the water stopped rising 342 meters. Dan stood on the upper deck and looked out at a world that no longer existed. The horizon was flat and empty in every direction. No shore, no buildings, no trees, only water, gray, heavy, motionless water stretching from edge to edge. The platform jutted out of the ocean like the last tooth in a giant's jaw. The upper levels were dry. The lower 2 were underwater, but the bulkheads were holding. The system showed structural integrity at 68%, acceptable. The desalination plant was running. The generators were running. The farm was intact. Una was making breakfast. Life went on. The first 2 days after the water stopped were quiet. Too quiet. The radios were silent. Of the thousands of voices that had been screaming into the airwaves on the first day, only a handful remained, rare, faint signals. Someone on some ship was transmitting coordinates and asking for help. Then they fell silent. Emma kept recording everything. On the 4th day, Haley spotted the first object on the radar, a ship. It was coming from the southeast, slowly. Dan went up to the bridge and looked at the screen. Judging by the size of the blip, it was a medium-sized vessel, a fishing trawler, or a small dry cargo ship. Dan grabbed his binoculars and went out on deck. 20 minutes later, he spotted the ship, a fishing vessel, 30 meters long. It was sitting low in the water. The deck was packed with people. Dan counted 60, maybe 70 people. They stood shoulder to shoulder. Some were sitting on the wheelhouse roof. The vessel was heading straight for the platform. Dan lowered his binoculars. Here it was, the first decision that would determine everything that followed. In its past life, the Magellan had taken in anyone and everyone. By the end of the first month, there were 600 people on board. There wasn't enough water. There wasn't enough food. Fights broke out, then mutinies. Then Mason Crow decided it was easier to throw the excess people overboard than to share rations with them. Dan went down to the mess hall. He gathered the core of the crew, Hank, Morgan, Una, Haley, Sarah, Emma, Tom, Raoul. He said a ship with 60 people was on its way to them and that they couldn't take everyone. Silence. Una was the first to break it. She asked how many they could take. Dan said 10, maybe 15. Any more would overwhelm the supply system. The farm isn't producing a harvest yet. Supplies are calculated for 35 people for 3 months. If they added 60, the supplies would last 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, all 80 would be starving. Sarah said quietly that this meant choosing who would live. Dan looked at her. He said it meant choosing who they could save without killing those they'd already saved. Morgan asked what criteria they should use to select people. Dan replied, children, doctors, engineers, people with skills needed on the platform. He'll give the rest water as much as he can and food for a week, along with the coordinates of the nearest locations where other survivors might be. That's all he can do. Hank lowered his head. Una clutched the edge of her apron with both hands. Haley slammed her fist on the table and said it was bullshit. Dan replied that yes, it was bullshit. And it would happen every time a ship came to them. Every time he'd have to make a decision, and every time it would be bullshit. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was the Magellan. He didn't explain what he meant. A fishing boat pulled up to the platform an hour later. Dan went out onto the lower deck with a megaphone. People were standing on the boat, dirty, wet, frightened. Women were clutching their children close. The men looked at the platform as if it were the promised land. Dan raised the megaphone. He said he could take 15 people, children, and those with medical or engineering training. He would give the rest water and food, but they wouldn't be able to disembark onto the platform. A commotion broke out on the ship's deck. Shouts, cries. One man started shouting that they had a right to be there and that people couldn't be turned away. Dan stood motionless. He waited. 10 minutes later, the ship's captain came up to the bridge and took the megaphone. An elderly man in a dirty uniform. He said there were 4 children on board. one nurse, one mechanic. He was ready to send them to the platform. The rest would stay on the ship, but he needed water, at least 1 metric ton. Dan gave them 2 metric tons, 400 liters per person, plus 3 boxes of emergency rations, plus the coordinates of the Poseidon II oil platform 40 miles to the northeast. It was empty, deserted, but still standing on its supports, and the upper levels were dry. If they have enough fuel to get there, they'll be able to take shelter there. The captain nodded. 15 people made their way onto the platform. 4 children aged 3 to 11, a nurse named Jenny, a mechanic named Alex. 9 more people whom Dan had selected based on their skills. 2 fishermen, a cook, an electrician, and 5 strong men ready to work. The fishing boat headed northeast. Dan stood on the deck and watched it sail away. Una was already leading the children to the dining hall. The youngest girl, 3 years old, clung to Una's hand and wouldn't let go. Una picked her up and held her close. The girl buried her face in Una's neck. Sarah was examining the new arrivals at the medical station. Dehydration, sunburn. One man had an infected wound on his leg. Sarah cleaned it and applied a bandage. In silence, exactly. Just like in a war, now there were 37 people living on the platform. 4 of them were children. Dan took inventory of their supplies. They now had enough food to last 2.5 months. If the farm got up and running on time, they'd hold out. If not, they'd have to fish and hunt. On the 8th day after the rise, the surface dwellers came to them. Night, 2 o'clock. Emma picked it up on the sound sensor, a low-frequency vibration. Close, very close. She sounded the alarm over the intercom. Dan ran out onto the deck with a flashlight. Haley was already there with a spear gun. The spotlight on the upper deck turned on and swept its beam across the water. At first, they saw a glow, blue, pulsating. It was coming from beneath the platform. Then a head rose from the water, or what could be called a head. 8 meters of chitinous armor covered with growths. 2 eyes the size of a car wheel, glowing yellow. Tentacles as thick as a human thigh wrapped around the platform's support. The platform creaked. The creature was rising higher. Haley raised her harpoon gun. Dan stopped her, told her to wait. He looked at the creature and counted. In a past life, the first riser had killed 3 people on the Magellan because no one knew how to fight it. They fired pistols. It was useless. The chitin was 5 centimeters thick. The bullets bounced off. The only weak spot was the soft tissue beneath the shell, the joints between the segments, and the eyes. Dan pointed out the spot to Haley, the joint between the head and thoracic segments. The chitin is thinner there. He told her to shoot there. Haley took aim. She fired. The harpoon entered the gap between the segments. The creature twitched. Its tentacles clamped down on the support so hard that the metal groaned. A dark liquid with a blue glow gushed from the wound. Dan shouted for a second harpoon. Raoul handed it to him. Dan reloaded the gun and fired himself. The second harpoon struck right next to the first. The creature shuddered all over. Its tentacles relaxed. It began to slide off the support back into the water. Haley fired a 3rd time, right in the eye. The yellow light went out. The creature went limp and crashed into the water with a heavy splash. The surface glowed blue from the blood flowing out. Silence. Dan stood on the deck, breathing heavily. Then he looked at Haley. She was trembling. Not from fear, from adrenaline. She was smiling. Wildly. She said it was the biggest fish she'd ever killed. Dan didn't smile. He was looking at the carcass floating alongside the ship. The system was already analyzing it. The blue interface flickered with data. Biological resources detected. Deep-sea chitin mass 340 kilograms, equivalent to a structural composite. Tensile strength, 6 times that of steel at 1/6 the mass. Bioluminescent glands, 22 in number. Autonomous light source. Operational life without external power, 4 years. Gastric enzyme, mass, 12 kilograms. Desalination catalyst, accelerates the process tenfold. Dan closed his eyes for a second. There it was, the first real resource of the New World. every surface dweller killed provided materials that no one else had. Armor, light, clean water. He opened his eyes and gave the order. Haul the carcass onto the deck. Butcher it before dawn. Hank and Raoul lowered the winch. 4 hours of work. By morning lay neat stacks of chitin plates, jars of bioluminescent fluid, a container of enzyme. Morgan stood over the laid-out organs, too overwhelmed with awe to speak. She had never seen anything like it, an organism that had lived at a depth of 3 kilometers and had come to the surface. Its biology defied everything she knew. She asked Dan to preserve the samples for study. Dan nodded. Then he turned to Una, who was standing in the dining hall doorway, looking at the carcass. She asked if they could eat it. Dan said the meat needed to be tested for toxicity. Morgan would take samples. If it was safe, then they could. Una nodded and said she needed a very large frying pan. The water level had stabilized at 342 meters. The first ship carrying refugees arrived at the platform, and Dan made the difficult decision to take only 15 people, giving the rest water and the coordinates of the empty Poseidon II platform. On the 8th day after the rise, the crew killed the first riser, and the system broke it down into valuable resources: chitin armor, bioluminescent light sources, a desalination enzyme catalyst. There are 37 people on the platform. The 3rd week after the rise, there are 41 people on the platform. 4 more people washed ashore on an inflatable raft. A family, a father, a mother, and 2 sons. The father was a plumber. The mother was an elementary school teacher. Dan took them in without hesitation. A plumber on the platform is worth their weight in gold. A teacher for 4 children is a godsend, too. Una set them up in a cabin on the 2nd level and fed them double portions for the first 3 days, until Sarah said they'd overcome their dehydration and could switch to the standard ration. Dan was working with chitin. The system displayed the blueprints. 340 kilograms of chitin composite from the first resurfacer had for the plating of 2 critical sections on the lower level, where the welds were weakest. Hank was welding the fasteners. Raoul was fitting the plates. Dan was in charge. The work went quickly because the system calculated every joint perfectly. The plates fit together like building blocks. After the 3rd plate, Hank stopped grumbling and started whistling. He said that in 30 years of work, he'd never seen a material that cut like plastic but held up like armor steel. Dan replied that it was deep-sea chitin. Morgan would have said it was a unique biopolymer formed under 300 atmospheres of pressure. Hank said he liked the armor steel version better. Emma installed bioluminescent glands in the corridors of the lower levels, 22 light sources that required no electricity, a soft blue glow, enough to see where you're going, a saving for the generator. When Una first walked down the corridor with the blue lights, she stopped and said it was beautiful, like if you were walking along the seafloor. Then she thought for a second and added that the seafloor was where the creature that had nearly killed them a week ago had come from. Beautiful, but eerie. Dan added the enzyme catalyst to the desalination system. The result exceeded the system's calculations. The desalination plant's output increased from 8 metric tons to 32 metric tons of fresh water per day. 32 metric tons. That's enough for 1,000 people. Dan had 41. He became the first person in the New World to have a surplus of the most valuable resource. Water is currency. Water is power. Water is life. Dan began transmitting over the radio on open frequencies. A simple message: Atlas 7 platform. Coordinates, trade, fresh water in exchange for labor and materials. Responses came on the 2nd day. The first to respond was the cargo ship North Star. Captain Olsen, a Norwegian, a former merchant seaman, 120 people on board. They have fuel, diesel, 18 metric tons. No water. They ran out 2 days ago. The crew is drinking rainwater collected in tarps. It's not enough. Dan proposed a trade, 5 metric tons of diesel for 10 metric tons of fresh water. Captain Olson agreed without hesitation. 6 hours later, the Northern Star moored to the platform. Dan personally oversaw the exchange. Water hoses, fuel pumps. Haley was in charge of mooring. It was her first time overseeing an operation of this scale. She handled it perfectly. Captain Olson climbed onto the platform, an elderly man with a white beard and a weather-beaten face. He looked at the desalination plant, at the farm, at the dining hall, at the children running down the hallway. Then he turned to Dan and quietly asked, "How? How had he done it?" Dan replied that he'd known what was coming and had prepared for it. Captain Olson looked at him for a long time. Then he said that if Dan ever needed sailors on the North Star, there were 12 men who would follow him to the ends of the earth. Dan replied that the ends of the earth had already arrived, and that he didn't need 12, but all 120. But not now, when there was room. Olson nodded and went back to his ship. The North Star dropped anchor 2 miles from the platform, the first ally. The 4th week, the second riser arrived at night. Bigger than the first, 12 meters, not a squid, something else. It looked like a crab with 6 legs and a shell covered in coral growths. It crawled onto the lower deck and began gnawing at the metal. It was literally eating the steel. Morgan later explained that deep-sea organisms of this type feed on minerals. Iron is food to them. Dan woke up Haley and Raoul. 3 harpoons, 10 minutes of fighting. Haley fired. Raoul reloaded. Dan shone the spotlight and pointed out the weak spots. The system highlighted the joints in its carapace. The creature twitched and wheezed. After the 4th harpoon, it fell silent. Gutting it took all night. 510 kilograms of chitin, 31 bioluminescent glands. And something new. A coral growth on the carapace. The system identified it as biocement, an organic material that hardens in seawater and becomes harder than concrete. This changed everything. You can't make concrete in this new world. No factories, no sand of the right grain size, no cement. But biocement from the coral growths of the surface dwellers is a substitute. Dan looked at the system's data and saw the future. Bridges between platforms, walls, foundations, all made from material that grows on the shells of deep-sea creatures. Tom looked at the biocement and said that if this material was non-toxic, it could be used as a substrate for hydroponics. Morgan confirmed this after analysis. Non-toxic. Moreover, it contains micronutrients that are ideal for plant growth. Tom nodded and took 20 kilograms back to the farm. A week later, the seedlings in the trays with the biocement cement substrate were growing 1.5 times faster than in regular soil. The farm was ahead of schedule. The first lettuce harvest came in 4 weeks instead of 6. Dan reinforced the weak sections of the platform with a chitin composite and increased the desalination plant's capacity to 32 metric tons per day using the emerged one's enzyme. He began trading water and acquired his first ally, Captain Olson, aboard the ship North Star. The second riser they killed yielded biocement, which proved to be a versatile construction and agricultural material. There were 41 people on the platform. The 6th week after the rise, Dan stood in the wheelhouse and looked at the map. Not a paper one. The system was rendering a map of the New World in real time based on radio intercepts and information from Allied ships. The map was terrifying. North America had turned into an archipelago. The Rocky Mountains jutted out of the water like a mountain range in the middle of the ocean. The Appalachians had become islands. Mexico had almost completely disappeared. Europe had become a cluster of small islands around the Alps and the Scandinavian mountains. Asia was holding up better, the Himalayas, Tibet, and part of China. But the coastlines no longer existed. 4 billion people had lived along the coastlines. Now there were no coastlines. Dan closed the map. He didn't need a map of the world. He needed a map of the nearest 100 miles. And on that map were 3 points. Atlas 7, his home. Poseidon 2, an empty platform 40 miles to the northeast. That's where Dan had sent a fishing vessel in the early days. The captain made it there. He survived. He reported over the radio that the platform was standing on its supports. The upper levels were dry, but there was no electricity, no water, no food. 60 people were sitting in the dark, waiting. And the third point, Triton 9, a platform 70 miles to the southwest, and that was the problem. 10 days ago, a radio intercept picked up communications on a military frequency, a man's voice with a commanding tone. He called himself Captain Crow. Dan's heart sank when he heard that name. Mason Crow, a former Coast Guard lieutenant, the man who, in a past life, had given the order to throw Dan overboard from the Magellan, the man who had shot him 3 times in the chest. Now Mason was in command of the Triton 9. He had seized the platform on the second day after the rise. With him were 40 armed Coast Guard men and 200 civilians he'd rounded up along the way. He established strict order on the platform, military style, hierarchical. Those who worked got to eat. Those who didn't were thrown overboard. From radio intercepts, Mason already knew about the floating oasis with fresh water. He didn't know the exact coordinates. Not yet, but he was searching. Dan realized that a confrontation was inevitable. The only question was when. He turned to Lee Ji-eun. She was standing in the doorway of the wheelhouse. Quiet, reserved, she had arrived at the platform a week ago, alone, on a small boat with holes in the hull. A pirate patrol had been chasing her. 2 fast boats with armed men. Haley sent her boat out to intercept them. A searchlight, a megaphone, a warning shot from a harpoon gun. The pirates turned back. Lee Ji-eun climbed onto the platform on her own. She refused help. A bloodied hand, a cut on her forehead. She looked at Dan and said one word in English, "Thank you." Then she lost consciousness. Sarah revived her an hour later. The wound on her arm was shallow. The cut on her forehead was from a piece of broken glass. Nothing serious. When Lee Ji-eun came to, Dan was sitting by her bed. He asked who she was. She answered briefly. A former intelligence officer in the South Korean Navy. A deserter. She left the military after refusing to carry out an order she considered criminal. She was in San Francisco when it started. She made it to a boat. She'd been heading south for 2 weeks. She'd lost track of the days. Dan asked what she was capable of. She looked him in the eye and listed her skills. Navigation, tactics, small arms, hand-to-hand combat, radio intelligence, electronic surveillance. Dan nodded and told her she needed to rest. They'd talk later. Lee Ji-eun rested for exactly 4 hours. Then she got up and found Dan in the wheelhouse. She asked about the tactical situation. Dan unfolded the map. He pointed to 3 locations. He explained the situation. Atlas 7 in the center, Poseidon 2 to the northeast. Triton 9 under Mason Crow's control was in the southwest. Lee Ji-eun studied the map in silence for 5 minutes. Then she said the position was good. Atlas 7 was between 2 platforms. If they took Poseidon 2 under our control and reactivate it, Mason will find himself between 2 hostile positions. It's a classic tactical pincer maneuver. Dan looked at her. He hadn't thought of it in those terms. He thought like an engineer. She thought like an officer. Together, it worked. Dan said he wanted to appoint her as the platform's head of security. Lee Ji-eun was silent for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. She said she needed 3 things: weapons, people, information. Dan replied that there weren't many weapons, but there would be more. There weren't many people, but they were reliable. And he had more information than she expected. He said this and saw Lee Ji-eun narrow her eyes slightly. She sensed something. This woman was a scout. She could spot lies and half-truths just as Dan could spot cracks in welded seams. She didn't ask, but she remembered. 2 days later, Dan sent an expedition to the Poseidon 2. Haley piloted the boat. With her were Raoul, Derek, and 4 new crew members from the North Star team assigned by Captain Olson. On board were 20 metric tons of water, spare fuses, tools, and generator parts. Dan gave Raoul precise instructions: which panels to open, which fuses to replace, which valves to turn. He knew the Poseidon 2. Not as well as the Atlas 7, but well enough. He'd worked on it for 2 years early in his career. The expedition returned 3 days later. Raoul
Reported the Poseidon II is operational. The generators are running. The desalination plant is working. The people on the platform have water and electricity. The captain of the fishing vessel offered Dan an alliance. Dan agreed.
There's one condition. Atlas 7 rules apply on Poseidon 2. No one is thrown overboard. Everyone works. Everyone eats. Children go to school. The sick are treated. 2 platforms. 102 people. Dan stood on the deck and looked toward the southwest. Somewhere out there beyond the horizon, Mason Crow was sharpening his claws. Dan learned that Mason Crow had seized the Triton 9 70 miles to the southwest. Lee Ji-yoon, a former South Korean intelligence officer, had arrived on the platform and become head of security. The expedition had revived Poseidon II and formed an alliance between the 2 platforms. Dan now had 2 platforms and 102 people. A clash with Mason was inevitable. It was the 3rd month after the rise. The first storm came without warning. Within 2 hours, the wind had picked up from calm to hurricane force. Waves as tall as a 3-story building pounded the platform's supports. Atlas 7 shook from its foundation to its antenna. Dan was in the wheelhouse. The system illuminated the structure. Red dots flashed one after another, a welded seam on the northeast support, a bolted joint on the 2nd level, wind turbine mounting. Every red dot was a potential disaster. Dan sent people out one by one. Hank to the support, welding in the rain. Sparks flew horizontally and died out in the wall of water. Raoul to the 2nd level, tightening bolts. Derek on the roof, securing the turbine. Everyone was working in the dark, knee-deep in water. Emma sat in the wheelhouse and monitored every sensor. She had written an alert script an hour before the storm, when the pressure began to drop. Now the script was continuously scanning all systems and prioritizing them. What to fix first, what could wait, and what was critical. Sarah set up an emergency station in the mess hall. 2 people were injured in the first hour. One slipped on the wet deck and broke his wrist. The other cut himself on a sheet of metal torn loose by the wind. Sarah applied splints and stitched the wounds while talking non-stop in a quiet, steady voice. Yuna fed everyone who came running in from the deck. Hot soup, coffee, rice, and fish. She hadn't slept all night. She stood at the stove and cooked. Squid sat on the fridge and watched. Shell hid under Emma's bunk and didn't come out. The storm lasted 18 hours. By morning, the wind had died down. Dan walked around the platform. The damage was serious, but not catastrophic. 1 wind turbine had been torn off. The railing on the upper deck was bent. 3 windows were shattered. There was a leak in the 2nd level corridor. But the supports were intact. The generators were intact. The desalination unit was intact. The truss was intact. Tom had covered the greenhouse with a tarp an hour before the storm and hadn't lost a single tray. The system indicated a structural integrity of 61%, lower than before the storm, but repairable. A week after the storm, Mason Crow made contact. Open frequency. His voice was calm and confident. He addressed the commander of Atlas Station. He said he knew about the 2 platforms under Dan's control. He knew about the water supplies. He proposed a meeting in neutral waters to discuss cooperation. Lee Ji-yoon listened to the transmission while standing next to Dan. When Mason finished, she looked at Dan and said one word: trap. Dan shook his head. Not a trap. Reconnaissance. Mason wants to see for himself who he's dealing with, to assess their strength, to find their weakness. Dan accepted the invitation. Haley piloted the boat. Dan, Lee Ji-yoon, Hank, 4 of them. The meeting took place 20 miles from the Atlas 7 open ocean. Mason arrived on an icebreaker. The old Russian icebreaker Captain Sorokin, which he had captured in the early days after the rise. Powerful, armed. Men with weapons stood on deck. Assault rifles. Dan counted 12 barrels. Mason descended the gangway onto the liaison boat, tall, broad-shouldered, short-cropped hair, a weather-beaten face, eyes that were light and cold. Dan looked at him and remembered. He remembered those eyes looking down at him as he lay on the deck of the Magellan with 3 bullets in his chest. He remembered how those hands had given the order. He remembered falling overboard. Mason didn't recognize him because they had never met in this life. Mason spoke eloquently. He proposed an alliance, 3 platforms, a single command, shared resources. He said that together they would be stronger than apart, that he had 400 men and weapons. Dan had water and food, a perfect alliance. Dan listened in silence. Then he asked one thing. What does Mason do with those who can't work? Mason smiled slightly. He said that on his platform, everyone finds their place. Everyone is useful. Dan knew that was a lie. Lee Ji-eun's radio intercepts had recorded 3 instances in the last month when people were thrown off the Triton 9 for minor infractions. Dan stood up. He said he'd think about it. Mason nodded. But when Dan turned his back on him, he saw in the reflection on the wheelhouse window that Mason was watching him walk away, without a smile, calculatingly. On the way back, Lee Ji-eun said they had 2 months at most. Mason wouldn't wait forever for an answer. He'd take by force what he couldn't get with words. Dan knew that. He knew the routes, he knew the dates. He knew that in his past life, Mason had attacked other groups of survivors about 5 months after the rise. By that time, his people were starving badly enough to take any risk. 2 months to prepare. Dan went down to the bridge and opened the system, the defense systems module, turrets based on harpoon launchers, blinding searchlights, acoustic sirens to scare off the risers and pirates, underwater nets to prevent boarding. Everything required chitin, steel, electronics, and manpower. He did the math. He'd need to kill 6 more surfers to gather enough material for a full defensive system. 6 creatures the size of a bus. Dan rubbed his forehead. He glanced at his watch. It was 2:30 in the morning. Yuna had left him a pot of rice and stewed fish in the kitchen. He ate standing by the window, staring out at the black ocean. Somewhere down there swam creatures that could kill him, and he needed them alive, or rather, dead. It was the cruel paradox of the new world. Monsters had become a resource. Enemies had become building materials. The first storm had damaged the platform, but the structure had held up. Mason Crow had contacted him and proposed an alliance. Dan met with him and saw that he was the same predator as in his past life. Lee Ji-eun estimated they had 2 months before Mason's attack. Dan began preparing a defense system, using resources from the resurfaced. The 5th month after the rise, week 47, Dan stood in the bridge and listened to Lee Ji-eun's report. She had intercepted communications from the Red Whale. The name Mason Crow's fleet now went by. 8 ships, 450 people. Mason had joined forces with the Aqua Corps Corporate Convoy, former top executives of an oil company who had seized 3 tankers and wanted to nationalize Dan's platform. Together, they had 26 ships against Dan's 3 platforms. The attack is scheduled for tonight. Lee Ji-eun knew the exact time, 3 a.m., a classic nighttime boarding operation. Mason's icebreaker will go first, followed by the Aqua Corps tankers. The goal was to cut off Atlas 7 from Poseidon 2 and Triton 9. Yes, Triton 9 now belonged to Dan as well. 3 weeks ago, 200 civilians aboard Triton 9 had staged a revolt against Mason's men. Lee Ji-eun organized it via the radio network. She provided the rebels with information and coordination. Mason lost the platform overnight. His men left on the icebreaker. The civilians asked Dan for help. He sent Raoul with a crew and 20 metric tons of water. Triton 9 became the Federation's 3rd platform. 300 people. Mason lost his base. He lost 200 civilians who had been supporting him. He lost face. Now he was out for revenge. Dan gathered the commanders: Haley, Lee Ji-eun, Hank, Captain Olson, Morgan and Emma. He laid out the situation. 26 ships, a night attack, 3 o'clock in the morning. Lee Ji-yoon proposed a plan. Don't defend. Lure them in. Dan looked at her. She explained. Atlas 7 has one weapon that no one else in the New World possesses. The surfers? Over the course of 5 months, Morgan had studied their migration routes. Every 12 days, a flock of 20 or 30 individuals passed 10 miles south of the platform. Morgan tracked them using sound sensors. The next passage was in 2 days, at night. Lee Ji-yoon suggested luring the pod to the battle site. Morgan said that the surfers react to low-frequency vibrations. Ship engines produce exactly those vibrations. 26 ships with their engines running are like a feast for a pod of hungry creatures. Dan was silent for a long time. He was thinking about what that meant. Luring the Emerge to the enemy fleet would mean killing hundreds of people, not just Mason's people. There were civilians on the Aqua Corps ships, too. Sailors. Maybe children. Morgan seemed to read his thoughts. She said they could direct the swarm to a specific target, not the entire fleet, just the vanguard, Mason's icebreaker, and the 2 ships closest to it. If the snake's head is cut off, the tail will turn around. Dan asked how to direct the swarm to a
Specific target. Emma raised her hand. She said quietly that she'd written a program for the sound emitters, a low-frequency pulse at the frequency the emerged use for hunting. She could create a false source at any point within a 4-kilometer radius of the platform. Wherever the system was active, Emma could lure the swarm toward a specific ship. Dan looked at her. A 22-year-old girl in glasses with a cat on her lap was suggesting they use deep-sea monsters as weapons. He nodded. 2 days to prepare. The defensive turrets were loaded. The searchlights were checked. The protective nets were in place. Emma had installed sound emitters on 4 buoys 2 kilometers south of the platform.
Lee Ji-yoon handed out the weapons. 3 harpoon guns, 2 hunting rifles, pistols. Not much. But the main weapon was underwater. Night. A storm. The rain was coming down in sheets. Waves were crashing over the lower decks. Haley's radar picked up Mason's fleet at 2:40. 26 vessels, sailing in formation, an icebreaker in the lead. Dan stood in the wheelhouse. The system highlighted each ship. Distance, speed, course. 12 minutes until contact. Dan picked up the radio and told Emma to turn on the emitters. Emma pressed the button. A low-frequency hum emanated from the 4 buoys. The human ear couldn't hear it, but something underwater did. Morgan was monitoring the acoustic sensors. 4 minutes later, she reported that the pod was changing course. It was heading toward the source of the signal. 32 objects, large. 8 minutes later, Mason Crow entered the zone. His icebreaker was 2 kilometers from the platform. Dan stepped out onto the upper deck. Rain lashed his face. Everyone lined up behind him. Morgan with a tablet, Yuna with a thermos. She shoved the thermos into Dan's hands and said he hadn't had a drink in 7 hours, and that was unacceptable. Haley with a harpoon gun. Sarah with a medical bag. Emma had a laptop with wires running from it to the public address speaker. Lee Ji-yoon had a sniper rifle she'd assembled from parts found on the Triton 9. Dan turned on the speakerphone. His voice came over the open frequency. He said, "Mason, I remember you. You don't remember me, but I remember you. In another life, you threw me overboard because you were running out of water. Right now, I have enough water to supply your entire fleet for 3 years. But I won't, because you didn't understand the most important thing. The sea isn't a place where loners survive. The sea is a place where families survive. I have a family. You have a crew. There's a difference. Lower your weapon, Mason. For once in your life, do the right thing." Silence on the radio. 3 seconds. Then Mason's voice. Cold. Mocking. He said he didn't know what other life Dan was talking about, but he knew that in 10 minutes, the Atlas 7 would be his. Dan closed his eyes for a second, then he opened them. He looked at Emma and nodded. Emma switched the emitters to attack frequency. A glow rose from the depths, blue, bright, blinding. The water around the icebreaker boiled. 32 emerged struck simultaneously. Tentacles wrapped around the icebreaker's hull. Chitinous claws dug into the side. The icebreaker listed. The deck lights flickered and went out. People's screams mingled with the roar of metal. 2 ships next to the icebreaker were struck by the swarm. They capsized within minutes. The remaining 23 ships began to turn away. Panic. Collisions in the darkness. 2 tankers crashed into each other. Another ran aground on what, just a month ago, had been the crest of a hill in Louisiana. 90 seconds later, half of Mason's fleet had ceased to exist. The rest were fleeing at full speed into the darkness. The icebreaker lay on its side. Mason Crow went down with his flagship. Dan didn't see him sink. The radar blip just vanished. Silence. Only rain and waves. Dan turned to his crew. Their faces were wet, their eyes wide. He said quietly, "Let's go fix the second generator." It shorted out when Emma connected the emitters. "And Una, pour me that coffee already. Otherwise, I'm really gonna pass out right now." Una unscrewed the lid of the thermos. Her hands didn't tremble. She poured coffee into a mug and silently handed it to him. Dan took a sip, hot, strong, real. Behind him, dawn was breaking on the horizon. The first year after the rise, Dan sat at a table in the Atlas 7 dining hall and wrote in the logbook. Day 365, the Federation's population, 813 people. 3 platforms connected by steel bridges. Bridges made of chitin composite and bio-cement, lightweight and durable. You can walk across them from one end of the Federation to the other. 20 minutes from Atlas 7 to Poseidon 2. 35 minutes to Triton 9. He put down his pen and leaned back in his chair. The dining hall was full. It was lunchtime. Una was in charge of the kitchen staff of 3 cooks. She no longer cooked alone. She had assistants, 2 women from Poseidon 2, and a guy from North Star. But the recipes were hers. And every evening, she personally served the first plate, a tradition. Today was a special day, exactly 1 year. Una had baked bread, real bread made from flour that Tom had milled from wheat grown on the farm. The first wheat of the new world. The aroma filled all 3 levels. People came into the dining hall just to breathe it in. Hank took a piece of bread and chewed it slowly. He closed his eyes. He said he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten bread. Then he opened his eyes and added that he did remember. Yesterday, because Una bakes every day, and it's the best bread in the world. Una smacked him with a towel and said he was lying. The best bread is baked by her grandmother in Busan. Then she fell silent, because Busan was underwater. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After lunch, Dan went up to the upper deck. Morgan was standing at the railing, looking out at the ocean. She turned around when she heard his footsteps. She said she wanted to show him something. She led him to the lab. The lab had changed over the past year. Level 4, 60 square meters, microscopes, spectrometers, aquariums with samples of deep-sea fauna. Morgan led him to a table and opened her tablet. On the screen was a 3D model of the ocean floor. She said that over the past year, she'd gathered enough data to understand what had happened. The fault in the Mariana Trench didn't just force water out of the mantle. It opened a cavity that had existed for millions of years, an underground ocean. The volume of water in it is 3 times greater than that of all the surface oceans combined. And this underground ocean was inhabited. The creatures that surfaced aren't mutants. It's a separate ecosystem that has evolved for millions of years in complete isolation. Chitin, bioluminescence, biocement. None of this is an anomaly. It's the result of millions of years of evolution under pressures of thousands of atmospheres. Dan listened. Then he asked about the plaque. But 2 months ago, they killed a large surface dweller, 15 meters long. They found a brass plaque in its stomach. Coordinates Atlas -7. The date was 1847. The symbols matched the tattoo on the body of one of Mason's pirates. Morgan nodded. She had examined the plaque. The growths on it were of organic origin, the same biocement found on the emerged. But carbon analysis placed the age of the growths between 600 and 1,200 years. The plaque had been underwater for hundreds of years. The brass was not modern. The alloy's composition corresponded to 19th century technology. Someone in 1847 knew the coordinates of the spot where, 170 years later, an oil platform would be built, and they engraved them on the plaque and threw that plaque into the ocean. Morgan said quietly that there was something else. The symbols on the plaque. She had found similar ones in the archive that Emma had downloaded from the Library of Congress servers the day before the rise. 19th century nautical charts. On 3 charts from different years, points in the ocean were marked with the same symbols, 6 points. 6 coordinates scattered across the world's oceans. Dan looked at the map. 6 points, 6 anchors. He remembered what he knew from the depths, from that space between death and awakening, the entity beneath the Mariana Trench. Not a god, not a mind in the human sense. Something ancient. Something that lived in the subterranean ocean long before humans. It did not want humanity to disappear. Not out of love, out of symbiosis. Humans above, it below. Equilibrium. The ascent disrupted the balance. That's why it sent out anchors. People it sent back in time. It gave them the system. It gave them a chance to prepare. Dan was one of 6. The other 5 were somewhere out at sea, in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. Each on their own platform. Each was building his own home, and Dan had to find them. He turned to Morgan and said he needed long-range radio communication to the whole world. Morgan nodded. She said that Derek was already working on an antenna that would be able to reach Europe. Dan left the lab. He walked down the hallway lit by the blue glow of bioluminescent lamps, past the server room where Emma was talking to the shell about the database structure. Past the medical unit where Sarah was examining a pregnant woman from Poseidon 2. The first child to be born on the platform in 2 months. Past the workshop where Hank was teaching a young welder how to hold a torch. Past the farm where Tom was harvesting his 4th crop of tomatoes and talking to the plants. She stepped out onto the upper deck. Haley was standing by the new dock. Her boat was bobbing nearby. She'd named it Mr. Pupkin. That was its official name. It was painted on the side in white. It was the flagship of the fleet, which so far consisted of 4 motorboats and 1 converted tugboat. Haley saw Dan and waved. He nodded at her and walked toward the ladder leading to the very top. Lee Ji-eun was standing on the platform by the antenna. She was looking south through her binoculars. Dan stood next to her. She lowered the binoculars. She said quietly that the horizon was clear. Then she paused and added that she wanted to tell him something. Dan turned to face her. Lee Ji-eun took a photograph out of her breast pocket, a small worn one, a young man in a South Korean Navy uniform, smiling. Her brother, Dan, knew about him. He knew that he had stayed behind in Korea when it all began. 3 weeks ago, through the survivors' radio network that Dan had been building for half a year, he found a group of Koreans on the islands of the former Himalayas. Among them was a young sailor named Lee Min-ho, Ji-eun's brother. Dan organized a rescue operation. Captain Olsen on the North Star sailed 800 miles. He picked up a group of 23 Koreans. He brought them to the Atlas 7. When Lee Ji-eun saw her brother on deck, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there and looked at him. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, silently, for a long time. Now she stood next to Dan and looked at his profile. She said that an hour after hugging her brother, she made a decision. She said she was his, not as a woman, as a person. She does everything he needs, always. Dan was silent. Then he replied quietly that he would need a lot. The second year lay ahead. New Houston lay ahead. 40 platforms, 15,000 people, a school, a hospital, the law, and somewhere on the horizon, 5 people he needed to find. 5 anchors, 5 builders, 5 just like him. Lee Ji-eun nodded. She said she was ready. Dan went down to the dining hall. Everyone was there. Evening gathering, a tradition Yuna had started. Every evening at 7 o'clock, everyone who wasn't on watch gathered around the table. Yuna cooked. People ate. They talked. They laughed. Hank told stories. Raoul taught someone how to play poker. The kids are running between the tables. Kalmar is sleeping on a warm pipe. Obaloshka is sitting on Emma's lap. Morgan is arguing with Tom about soil acidity. Haley is teasing Derek. Sarah is quietly sipping tea in the corner and smiling for the first time tonight. Dan sat down at the table. Yuna placed a plate in front of him. Rice, fish, fresh tomatoes from the farm, and a piece of bread, warm, with a crust. Dan picked up the bread. He sniffed it. He closed his eyes for a second. In his past life, he'd forgotten what bread smelled like. He'd forgotten what home smelled like. He'd forgotten what laughter sounded like around a shared table. He opened his eyes and looked at the people around him. 813 people on 3 platforms in the middle of the ocean that had swallowed the world. In a year, there would be more of them. In 2 years, it would be a city. In 3 years, it would be a civilization. Not because he's a hero, not because he has a system or a memory of the future, but because Yuna bakes bread, and Hank smelts steel, and Morgan studies the ocean, and Sarah heals people, and Emma writes code, and Haley steers the ships, and Lee Ji-eun stands guard, and Tom grows tomatoes and talks to them. Dan took a bite of the bread. It was hot, soft, with a hint of salt. Everything here has a hint of salt. That's how the world works now. He looked at Yuna. She was standing at the stove, stirring the soup. She turned toward him. She smiled. He didn't smile back. He just nodded, quietly, like a man who had finally understood why he'd been given a second chance, not just to survive, but to give a home to those who'd lost theirs. Outside the dining room window, the ocean stretched to the horizon, dark, endless, salty. And somewhere out there on that ocean stood 5 more platforms, 5 lights, 5 anchors. Dan would find them, but that would be tomorrow. Today he's eating bread. Today he's home.